There is a place on this earth where four nations meet, where borders drawn by empires and treaties dissolve into something older, something more permanent. A place where the wind carries the harmonic tones of throat singing across valleys that have echoed with those same sounds for 4,000 years, where golden eagles circle above peaks that pierce the sky, at heights where the air grows thin, where every breath becomes a conscious act, a meditation, where permafrost holds secrets that the rest of the world surrendered to decay millennia ago. This is the Altai, the Golden Mountains, the meeting place of Russia, China, Mongolia, and Kazakhstan. And it is here, in these remote and eternal heights, that the earth has kept a record more perfect than any written by human hands. A record written in ice, in the bodies of the dead who were meant to be forgotten but instead became immortal, in the genes of 3 different human species who walked these valleys and left their DNA as messages in a bottle, floating through time to reach us now. In rock art that spans 10,000 years, showing us mammoths and shamans and the slow evolution of human thought carved into stone. The Altai is not simply a mountain range, it is a sanctuary and a prison, a crossroads and an isolation, a place where cultures came together and where cultures went to hide. It is one of the last places on Earth where the ancient world is not yet fully dead, where nomadic peoples still practice eagle hunting as their ancestors did 4 millennia ago, where shamans still climb to sacred peaks to speak with spirits, where the permafrost still holds the frozen dead in its embrace, refusing to let them go. Tonight we journey to this remote realm, to walk among peaks that have witnessed the entire story of humanity, from the Denisovans, ghost people we only discovered in 2008, a human species we didn't even know existed, to the Scythian warriors of the Pazyryk culture whose tattoos are still visible on their skin after 25 centuries in the ice, from the mystics and seekers who came here searching for Shambhala, to the old believers who fled here to escape persecution, hiding in valleys so remote that one family wasn't discovered until 1978, having lived in complete isolation for 40 years, unaware that World War II had even happened. This is a place where time moves differently, where the past is not past but present, frozen, preserved, waiting, where the mountains themselves are memory keepers holding stories in their ice and stone that challenge everything we thought we knew about human history, where 3 human species, Denisovan, Neanderthal, and our own ancestors overlapped not just in time but in blood, interbreeding in these valleys and leaving genetic traces that we carry in our bodies today. And as we climb higher into these eternal mountains tonight, as the air grows thinner and the stars grow brighter, and the silence deepens into something almost sacred, perhaps we will understand why this place has drawn seekers and mystics and scientists for centuries, why it feels like a doorway to something older, why the mountains, with their patience measured in ice ages, seem to whisper that there are still secrets buried here, still mysteries frozen in the permafrost, still stories waiting to be told. The story of the Altai begins not with humans at all, but with the mountains themselves. They rose in the Paleozoic era, some 300 million years ago, thrust upward by the collision of tectonic plates. They have been worn down by ice and wind, carved into their current forms by glaciers that have advanced and retreated dozens of times. And through all of those changes, through all of those ice ages and warming periods, they have stood as a barrier and a bridge, separating the great steppes of Central Asia from the Siberian forests to the north, yet providing passes through which peoples and ideas and genes could flow. The highest peak is Belukha Mountain. It rises to 14,783 feet and is considered sacred by the Altai people who live in its shadow. It is a mountain wrapped in ice year-round, its twin peaks like the prongs of a crown. The indigenous peoples call it Uch-Suma, the 3-headed mountain, and they believe it is the dwelling place of the goddess Umai, the protector of children and the hearth. To climb it without permission, without the proper prayers and offerings, is to invite disaster. But Belukha is not alone. The Altai range is vast, stretching over 1,200 miles and encompassing dozens of peaks that exceed 13,000 feet. The Katun River, which the Altai people also consider sacred, begins in the glaciers of Belukha and flows northward, its waters glacier cold and impossibly blue, carrying snowmelt from heights where nothing lives except lichen and stone. And then there is the Yukok Plateau, a high-altitude grassland at the far southern edge of the Russian Altai, where Russia meets Kazakhstan, China, and Mongolia. The Tlingit people who have lived there for centuries call it the end of everything. At over 8,000 feet in elevation, it is a stark and beautiful place, a treeless expanse where the grass grows short and tough, where the winds are constant, where summer lasts only a few weeks, and winter can drop temperatures to -40 degrees Fahrenheit. It is a place that feels less like Earth and more like the surface of another planet. Remote, austere, somehow timeless. It was here on the Yukok Plateau that the permafrost performed one of its greatest miracles of preservation. Here that a young woman who died 2,500 years ago was returned to us almost perfectly intact, her skin still bearing the intricate tattoos that marked her as someone special, someone sacred, someone whose story would echo across millennia. But before we meet her, before we encounter the Pazyryk people and their frozen tombs, we must go further back. We must descend into a cave in the foothills of the Altai, a cave that has been carved by the Anui River over hundreds of thousands of years. A cave that seems unremarkable from the outside but which holds inside it one of the most revolutionary discoveries in the history of human origins. This is Denisova Cave, and the story it tells is one that has rewritten our understanding of who we are. The cave sits at about 2,300 feet elevation in the Bashalak Range, not far from the village of Chernye Anui. It has 3 chambers, a large main gallery, a south gallery, and an east gallery. For decades, Russian archaeologists excavated it, finding stone tools and animal bones dating back over 280,000 years. The cave had clearly been occupied, on and off, for an immense span of time by various human groups. Then in 2008, a team led by Russian archaeologist Anatoly Derevyanko found something small, a finger bone, the distal phalanx of a child's pinky finger, in a layer of sediment dated to about 41,000 years ago. It was sent to the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology in Leipzig, where geneticist Svante Pääbo and his team extracted DNA from it. What they found should not have been possible. The DNA was human, but it was not from Homo sapiens. It was also not Neanderthal. It was something else entirely, a third branch of the human family tree that had split off from our common ancestor hundreds of thousands of years ago and had evolved in isolation, developing its own distinct genetic signature. A ghost species. One that had left no fossils substantial enough to identify, one that we had walked past for a century without noticing. The team named them after the cave where they were found, Denisovans. The implications were staggering. Modern humans and Neanderthals were not the only human species walking the earth 40,000 years ago. There was at least one other, and it lived here in the Altai. Over the next several years, more Denisovan remains would be found in the cave. Teeth, bone fragments, more finger bones. But the real revelation came from the DNA itself. Because the Denisovans did not simply live and die in these mountains. They met us. They met the ancestors of modern humans who were spreading out of Africa and into Asia. And in those meetings, something profoundly human happened. They did not just fight or flee. They interbred. They had children together, and those children carried Denisovan genes forward into the future, into populations that spread across Asia and into the Pacific. The implications of this discovery continue to unfold. The more we study ancient DNA, the more we realize that the human story is not a simple tale of one species replacing another. It is a complex braiding of lineages, a web of encounters and exchanges that has been going on for hundreds of thousands of years. We are not pure. We are hybrid. We carry within us the genetic legacy of multiple human species, and that hybridization may be part of what made us successful. Today, if you test the DNA of a Tibetan person living on the high plateau, you will find that they carry a version of the EPAS1 gene that came from the Denisovans. This gene helps the body adapt to low oxygen levels at high altitude. It regulates the production of red blood cells and hemoglobin in ways that prevent altitude sickness and allow for normal functioning in environments where the oxygen pressure is half what it is at sea level. It is, quite literally, the genetic memory of a people who lived in the thin air of mountains like these for hundreds of thousands of years. A physiological adaptation so valuable that it was preserved and passed down through 50,000 years of interbreeding and migration. The Denisovans gave the Tibetans the ability to live where the air is too thin for most humans to survive. Without this gene, permanent settlement of the Tibetan plateau would have been far more difficult, perhaps impossible. The Denisovans, in a very real sense, opened up an entire ecological niche for modern humans. Not through teaching or technology, but through biology, through the gift of DNA passed on in moments of intimacy thousands of years ago, in valleys not unlike these. And it is not just Tibetans. People of Melanesian descent from Papua New Guinea, Australia and the surrounding islands carry up to 5% Denisovan DNA. The Denisovans, it turns out, had a vast range. They stretched from Siberia to Southeast Asia, perhaps even further. They were successful, adaptive, widespread. They survived in environments ranging from frozen mountain caves to tropical forests, and everywhere they went they left traces in our genes. In some Pacific Island populations, specific Denisovan genes have been linked to immune system variations, suggesting that the interbreeding may have provided modern humans with genetic tools to fight diseases they had never encountered before. The same process happened with Neanderthals in Europe. Their genes helped modern humans adapt to colder climates and new pathogens. Hybridization was not a genetic dilution. It was a form of rapid adaptation, a way of acquiring locally evolved traits without waiting hundreds of thousands of years for natural selection to produce them. But the Denisova cave had more secrets. Further analysis revealed that the cave had been occupied by 3 different human species at different times: Denisovans, Neanderthals, and modern humans. And in 2018, an even more astonishing discovery was announced. A bone fragment from a girl who lived about 90,000 years ago was found to carry DNA from both Denisovan and Neanderthal parents. She was a first-generation hybrid. Her mother was Neanderthal, her father was Denisovan. The 2 species had not only overlapped in these mountains, they had formed families. This girl, whom scientists nicknamed Denny, was perhaps 13 years old when she died. Her very existence proves that these meetings between human species were not rare accidents, but part of the normal fabric of life in the Altai. The genetic analysis revealed even more complexity. Her Neanderthal mother had ancestry that was more similar to Neanderthals from Western Europe than those from the same cave, suggesting that Neanderthal populations themselves were mobile, mixing across vast distances. And Denny's Denisovan father had Neanderthal ancestry in his own background, meaning that the interbreeding between these species had been happening for many generations. The genetic picture is not of isolated species meeting once, but of populations that lived in proximity, that knew each other, that perhaps traded and communicated, and yes, loved each other. The boundaries between species were permeable. The categories we use to classify them, Denisovan, Neanderthal, Homo sapiens, may be too rigid to capture the fluid reality of how these people actually lived. Imagine that meeting, 2 different kinds of people, different enough that we classify them as separate species, yet similar enough to recognize something familiar in each other's eyes, similar enough to fall in love, to have children, to bridge a gap of hundreds of thousands of years of separate evolution. And imagine those children carrying the genes of both species, walking these same valleys and passes we walk tonight in our imaginations, feeling the same thin air and seeing the same peaks. The Altai, then, was not just a crossroads of cultures and nations, it was a crossroads of human species, a genetic melting pot where the very definition of human became blurred and complicated, and far more interesting than we ever imagined. A place where the family tree of humanity becomes not a simple branching diagram, but a tangled web of interbreeding and gene flow and shared history. Comment below and tell me where you're watching from tonight, and where the mountains call to something deep within you. The cave itself reveals this long occupation. Different layers of sediment contain artifacts from different periods, different peoples. Stone tools change in style and sophistication over time. The deepest, oldest layers show simple chopping tools and flakes. Higher layers show more refined blades and points. Animal bones show what was hunted: woolly mammoth, woolly rhinoceros, giant deer, bison, horses. The diet was rich and varied. These were skilled hunters who could bring down megafauna. But perhaps most intriguing, archaeologists found a bracelet in one of the Denisovan layers, a piece of jewellery made from polished chlorophyllite, a green stone with a drilled hole for a string. The craftsmanship is sophisticated. The stone was worked with precision, polished to a smooth finish, drilled with a tool that must have been harder than the stone itself. This is not the work of primitive beings. This is the work of people who cared about beauty, who had the time and skill to create objects not strictly necessary for survival, who perhaps gave gifts to each other, or wore adornments to signal status or identity. The bracelet sits in a museum, now green and smooth and perfect after 50,000 years. And looking at it, one cannot help but imagine the person who made it. The Denisovan craftsperson who selected the stone, who worked it patiently, who drilled the hole and threaded a cord through it, who wore it or gave it to someone they loved. A person whose face we will never see, whose name we will never know, whose species is extinct, but whose handiwork survives, beautiful and intentional and deeply human in the ways that matter most. And what makes this even more poignant is that the Denisovans left us so little else. No cities, no art that we can definitively attribute to them, just stone tools, this bracelet and DNA. They are a people we know almost entirely through their genes. Ghosts who live on inside us, their presence revealed only by the most sophisticated molecular archaeology. A species that was here, that walked where we walk, that loved and bred and passed their DNA forward, but left almost no trace except in the double helix. The mountains kept this secret for 40,000 years. The cave held it. The permafrost preserved the fragments of bone well enough that we could extract molecules that still carried information. And because of that preservation, that perfect frozen silence, we learned that the story of human evolution is far stranger and more beautiful than we ever dared imagine. But if you think the revelations of Denisova Cave are where the Altai's secrets end, you have not yet climbed high enough. You have not yet reached the Yukok Plateau. You have not yet entered the frozen tombs of the Pazyryk. 2,500 years ago, the Altai Mountains were home to a people who lived lives of extraordinary sophistication and beauty. They were nomads, but that word carries with it unfair connotations of primitiveness, of people barely surviving in harsh conditions. The Pazyryk people were nothing of the sort. They were the Scythians of the Altai, part of a vast confederation of horse-riding warrior cultures that dominated the steppes from the Black Sea to Mongolia. They bred horses that were among the most beautiful in the ancient world, small, sturdy, fast animals with flowing manes. They rode with a skill that astounded the settled peoples of China and Persia. They hunted with eagles. They made felt so fine and so richly dyed that it rivaled silk. They worked gold into flowing, dynamic forms, showing deer and griffins and fantastic beasts with antlers that spiraled into infinity. Their art style, what is called the Scythian animal style, is one of the great aesthetic achievements of the ancient world. All flowing curves and powerful musculature, creatures frozen mid-leap, full of a kinetic energy that makes them seem alive even now. They moved with the seasons, taking their herds to high summer pastures and returning to sheltered valleys for winter. They lived in felt yurts that could be assembled and disassembled in hours. Their wealth was not in cities or granaries, but in horses and gold and knowledge. Knowledge of the land, of the stars, of healing herbs, of where water could be found. They were not primitive. They were adapted, perfectly adapted to a landscape that would kill a settled farmer in a single winter. But they did build one thing that was meant to last. They built tombs, great burial mounds called kurgans, constructed on the high plateaus where the permafrost ran deep and constant. And in those tombs they placed their dead with everything they would need for the next world. Horses, often 6 or more, killed and buried alongside their riders. Food and drink in leather pouches and ceramic vessels. Gold ornaments and weapons. Felt carpets and textiles decorated with appliqué designs of astonishing complexity. And in some tombs the bodies were prepared, treated with mercury in an attempt at mummification. The Pazyryk did not intend for their dead to be forgotten. They prepared them to last for eternity, But what they could not have known, what they could not have planned for, was that the very act of building these tombs on the Yukok Plateau, at elevations where the ground never thaws, would create a preservative mechanism far more effective than any embalming process they could devise. Water seeped into the burial chambers soon after they were sealed. The Altai climate did the rest. In winter, temperatures dropped so low that the water froze solid. In summer, the permafrost and the insulating effect of the earthen mound prevented it from melting. The tombs became ice lenses. Sealed blocks of frozen water containing the dead and their possessions, held in perfect stasis for 2.5 millennia. Organic materials that would have rotted away in any other environment. Leather, felt, skin, hair, even the tattoos on human flesh were preserved as if they had died yesterday. The first Pazyryk tombs were discovered in the 1920s by Russian archaeologists, but the most famous, the most haunting, the one that has sparked the most controversy and wonder, was not found until 1993. It was that year that Russian archaeologist Natalia Polomak and her team were excavating a kurgan on the Yukok Plateau, not far from the border with Mongolia. As they dug through the frozen earth and ice, they found the bodies of 6 horses, their hides still intact, their manes still flowing. And beneath them, in a log chamber lined with birch bark, they found her. She was a woman, perhaps 25 years old when she died. Her body was wrapped in silk, evidence of trade with distant China. Her head had been shaved, but a wig of horsehair was placed on it, pinned with golden ornaments. She wore a tall headdress made of wood and felt, 3 feet high, decorated with birds and deer. On her hands were the remnants of what might have been gloves. And on her left shoulder, running down her arm, across her back, were tattoos. They called her the Ice Maiden. Others call her the Princess of Yukok. The Altai people call her by a different name, the Great Lady, the Akkadin. And they believe she was not simply a noble woman but a spiritual guardian, a shaman or priestess whose presence on the plateau protected the people and the land itself. Her tattoos were unlike anything seen before. They were not simple geometric patterns or rough markings. They were art, fantastic creatures rendered with flowing, confident lines, a deer with elaborate antlers that spiraled into abstract forms, a griffin with a raptor's beak and cat's body, a spotted panther, a mountain goat, a snow leopard, the same creatures that appear in Pazyryk goldwork and felt decorations, the same animal style that defined their art, but here, on human skin, preserved by the ice for 2,500 years, still visible in blue-black pigment, against the pale, mummified flesh. The animals were not random. They were powerful, symbolic creatures of the mountains and steppes, guardians and guides. In many shamanic traditions, tattoos are not mere decoration. They are spiritual armor, protection for the soul in its journeys beyond the body. The Ice Maiden wore her power on her skin. She had been buried with her 6 horses, all sacrificed and placed in the chamber with her. They wore bridles decorated with carved wooden ornaments covered in gold foil. Their manes were bright. Even in death, they were beautiful. The Pazyryk clearly believed that a person's status and power continued into the next life, that she would need these horses, these companions, for the journey ahead. But there was something else. The Ice Maiden's body showed signs of illness. Analysis revealed that she had suffered from breast cancer, which had metastasized. She was dying when she was buried, and there were traces of cannabis and mercury in her remains. Mercury likely from the mummification process, cannabis perhaps used medicinally to ease her pain, or ritually to induce the visions of a shaman. When the Ice Maiden was removed from her tomb and taken to a museum in Novosibirsk, the Altai people were horrified. To them, this was not archaeology. It was desecration. The disturbance of a sacred guardian who was meant to rest undisturbed on the plateau, protecting the land. Local elders protested. They said that removing her would bring disaster. And then the earthquakes began. In 2003, a magnitude 7.3 quake struck the Altai region, one of the strongest in its recorded history. Another in 2011, another in 2014. Each time, the Altai people pointed to the Ice Maiden. She had been taken from her home, they said. The land was angry. The balance was broken. Scientists dismissed this as superstition, as the attribution of natural geological events to unrelated human actions. But the Altai people were unmoved. They demanded her return. To this day, the Ice Maiden remains in a museum, displayed in a glass case where tourists and researchers can see her, and to this day the controversy continues, a clash not just between science and belief, but between different ways of understanding what we owe to the dead. What right we have to disturb those who are laid to rest with such care, and whose voices matter when the past is brought into the present. If you're finding this journey through eternal mountains and frozen time compelling, take a moment to like this video. But the Ice Maiden is not alone. Over the past century, dozens of Pazyryk tombs have been excavated from the Yukok Plateau and surrounding areas, and each one reveals more about this extraordinary culture. In one tomb, archaeologists found the oldest surviving pile carpet in the world, a felt carpet decorated with applique designs, showing riders on horseback, elk, and a procession of women. The colours were still vivid, the craftsmanship was breathtaking. It is now in the Hermitage Museum in St. Petersburg. In another tomb, they found leather pouches that still contained the remnants of coriander seeds and cannabis. The Pazyryk used cannabis, that much is clear, whether for ritual purposes to induce visions during shamanic ceremonies, or for medicinal use, or simply for the pleasure of it, we cannot say with certainty. But the plant was important to them, important enough to place in the grave. The textiles found in the tombs are astonishing. Felt made from wool, dyed in rich reds and blues and yellows, decorated with applique cutouts of animals and geometric patterns. Silk imported from China, thousands of miles to the east. Wool woven into intricate patterns. The level of craftsmanship speaks to a culture that valued beauty, that had time and skill to create objects not merely functional but sublime. The process of creating felt alone was labour-intensive. Wool from their sheep had to be cleaned, carded, and then wetted and worked, pressed and rolled and beaten, until the fibres matted together into thick, durable fabric. Then it had to be dyed using natural pigments. Madder root for reds, weld or saffron for yellows, woad or indigo for blues. Some of these dyes had to be imported from far away, evidence of trade networks extending hundreds or thousands of miles. A Pazyryk nomad herding sheep on the Yukok Plateau was connected, through trade, to dye producers in Central Asia, silk weavers in China, goldsmiths in Persia. The felt was not just functional, it was art. The Pazyryk created applique designs by cutting shapes from different coloured felt and stitching them onto backgrounds, creating elaborate scenes. One famous carpet shows a procession of riders on horseback, their clothing detailed, their postures noble. Another shows elk with elaborate antlers. The craftsmanship is extraordinary. The stitches are tiny and regular. The designs are proportional and balanced. The colour choices are bold and harmonious. And then there is the Chinese silk. Multiple tombs contained silk fabric, proof that the Pazyryk were trading with China, that luxury goods were moving along routes that would later be called the Silk Road. The silk was precious, exotic, a status symbol. To be buried with Chinese silk was to announce one's wealth and connections even in death. The global world, it turns out, is not a modern invention. 2,500 years ago, a nomadic woman on the Yukok Plateau could wear silk from China, golden ornaments made with techniques from Persia, and dyes from Central Asia, all while living in a felt yurt, herding sheep, and honouring gods and ancestors whose names we will never know. And then there are the tattoos, not just on the Ice Maiden but on other bodies as well. A man found in another tomb bore tattoos of similar style, animals running across his arms and back, each one rendered with the same flowing precision. The tattoos required skill, patience, and one imagines significant pain. They were not casual marks, they meant something. They said something about the person who wore them. The process of tattooing in the ancient world was arduous. Pigments were created from soot or mineral compounds, mixed with liquids to create an ink. The skin was pierced with needles, probably made from bone or bronze, and the pigment was worked into the punctures. The process would have taken hours, perhaps multiple sessions for the elaborate designs found on the Ice Maiden. It would have hurt. and yet both men and women bore these marks, suggesting that the pain was part of the meaning, that the act of receiving the tattoo was as important as wearing it, that the transformation of the body was itself a ritual. What the permafrost has preserved, then, is not just the fact of the Pazyryk culture, but its texture, the fine details that make the past feel present. We do not just know that they existed, we can see the blue of their felt, the gold on their horses' bridles, the ink on their skin. We can almost smell the leather and the wool. The ice has given us a level of preservation that exists almost nowhere else in archaeology. Pompeii gives us buildings and mosaics, but the organic materials are gone. The Egyptian tombs give us mummies and gold, but rarely the textiles and leathers in the condition we find here. The Altai gives us everything: skin and fabric and colour and detail. Even the horse's tack was elaborate. Bridles were decorated with carved wooden ornaments covered in gold foil. Some ornaments showed deer or birds, others showed abstract geometric patterns. The horses were not mere beasts of burden. They were companions, symbols of status, partners in life and death. To bury 6 horses with a person was an enormous sacrifice. Each horse represented years of breeding and training, a significant portion of a family's wealth. But the Pazyryk did it anyway. The spiritual logic outweighed the material cost. The horses would be needed. The journey ahead required them. And it gives us questions. Who was the Ice Maiden? Was she a priestess, a shaman, a warrior queen, or simply a beloved member of her community, buried with the honours befitting her station? We will likely never know for certain. The Pazyryk left no written language. Their voices are silent. All we have are the objects they cherished and the bodies they adorned, and the stories we try to construct from those fragments. But what we do know is that they were a people of immense sophistication, living in one of the harshest environments on Earth, creating art and culture and meaning in the shadow of these eternal mountains. They rode horses with unmatched skill, hunted with eagles, created textiles and goldwork that rival any produced in the settled empires of the time. They traded with China, with Persia, with the Greek colonies of the Black Sea. They were not isolated primitives. They were cosmopolitan, connected, cultured. And when they died, they were placed in the earth with such care, wrapped in silk and felt, surrounded by their horses and their possessions, sent into the next world with everything they needed to continue their journey. The mountains took them into the ice. The permafrost held them. And now, 2,500 years later, they emerge almost unchanged, ghosts of the Golden Mountains, their tattoos still visible, their horses still beside them, their story still unfolding. But the ice that preserved them is melting. Climate change is reaching even here, even to these remote heights. The permafrost is thawing. What has been frozen for millennia is beginning to rot. Archaeologists are racing against time, trying to excavate as many tombs as possible before the organic materials are lost forever. It is a cruel irony. The ice preserved them perfectly, but only as long as the ice remained. Now that it is melting, we face a window of perhaps a few decades in which to study these treasures before they are gone, this time permanently. The Pazyryk people did not know they would be remembered this way. They buried their dead intending them to rest forever. Instead, they created time capsules that would preserve their world in amber, or rather in ice, giving us a window into their lives more intimate than almost any other ancient culture. And now, in our age, we are faced with the question of what we owe them. Do we have the right to disturb their rest, to remove their bodies and display them, to study their DNA and publish our findings? The indigenous Altai people say no. They say the dead should rest, that some things are sacred, that not everything is meant to be known, and perhaps they are right. Perhaps there is a cost to this knowledge, a spiritual cost, or simply an ethical one. Perhaps the Ice Maiden was meant to stay on the plateau, guarding her land, her presence a blessing rather than an exhibit. But the scientists argue that understanding the past is a universal human good, that knowledge serves all of us, that the Ice Maiden's story, her tattoos, her horses, her illness, her culture, is not just the story of the Altai, but of all humanity, that we learn from her, that she teaches us. Both cannot be fully right, but both cannot be fully wrong either. It is a tension without resolution, the clash between the need to know and the need to honor, between science and spirituality, between the universal and the particular. And the Ice Maiden, silent in her glass case, offers no answer. She simply exists, frozen in time, caught between two worlds, her tattoos still visible after all these centuries, her story still told but never finished. The Altai Mountains are not merely a record of ancient peoples, they are also a record of ancient art, and perhaps ancient thought. Scattered across the valleys and ridges, carved into boulders and cliff faces, are thousands of petroglyphs, images hammered and scraped into stone over a period spanning more than 10,000 years. The most famous concentration is at Kazakhstan, a site along the Chusky Tract Highway, where over 5,000 petroglyphs are clustered across rock surfaces extending for nearly 12 miles. It is one of the largest rock art galleries in Central Asia, an outdoor museum created by hundreds of generations, each leaving its mark on the stone. The oldest images date back to the late Paleolithic period, perhaps 10,000 years ago or more. They show the animals of the Ice Age, mammoths with their distinctive curved tusks and shaggy profiles, woolly rhinoceroses, bison, horses. These were the creatures that the first peoples of the Altai hunted and lived alongside. And when the climate warmed and the megafauna went extinct, they were memorialized in stone. The mammoths are gone from the earth now, but here at Kazakhstan they remain, hammered into the rock with such detail that you can see the curve of their backs, the texture suggested in their hides, the sense of weight and presence. As the millennia passed, the style of the art changed. The Bronze Age peoples added images of wheeled vehicles, carts and chariots, marking the arrival of a new technology. The Scythian peoples, including the Pazyryk, added their animal style. The same flowing, dynamic deer and griffins and predators that appear on their gold work and textiles. Horses are everywhere, depicted in motion, manes flying, legs extended. Hunting scenes show archers pursuing ibex and elk. Shamanic figures with elaborate headdresses and outstretched arms stand in poses that suggest transformation, perhaps representing the out-of-body journeys that shamans claim to undertake. Later peoples added their own marks. Turkic runes from the 6th to 8th century CE, Buddhist symbols, even modern graffiti. The rocks became a palimpsest, layers of meaning and art superimposed over millennia. And through it all, the mountains held the images, preserving them through their sheer durability, their resistance to erosion, their patient endurance. What did these images mean to the people who made them? We can only speculate. Some may have been simple records, markers of successful hunts, territorial boundaries, or genealogies. Some may have been offerings, gifts to the spirits of the mountains or the animals depicted. Some may have been teaching tools, ways of passing down knowledge about the natural world and the stories of the people, and some may have been shamanic. Images created during or after trance states, attempts to capture visions or to communicate with the spirit world. The shamanic interpretation is particularly compelling given what we know about the indigenous Altai peoples and their spiritual traditions. Many of the figures at Kazakhstan and other sites show characteristics that suggest shamanic themes. Figures with elaborate headdresses, sometimes with antlers or horns, figures with outstretched arms in poses that suggest flight or transformation, anthropomorphic beings that blend human and animal characteristics, perhaps representing the shaman's spirit helpers or the shaman in a state of transformation. In shamanic traditions across Siberia and Central Asia, the shaman is a person who can cross boundaries between the human world and the spirit world, between life and death, between different forms of being. The shaman uses drumming, chanting, and sometimes psychoactive plants to enter trance states in which the soul is believed to leave the body and journey to other realms. There, the shaman can retrieve lost souls, negotiate with spirits, gain knowledge about the future or the distant past, and return with healing or prophecy. The rock art may be a record of these journeys. The animals may be spirit helpers or guides. The anthropomorphic figures may be shamans in their transformed state, or the spirits they encountered. Some images show humans and animals in direct relationship. A human touching an elk, a figure riding or standing beside a horse. These may represent the intimate connections that shamans claimed with the animal world. The ability to communicate, to understand, to share consciousness with other beings. One particularly intriguing type of image shows circles or concentric rings, sometimes with radiating lines, forms that anthropologists call entoptic phenomena. These are visual patterns that the human nervous system generates during altered states of consciousness, whether induced by meditation, fasting, fever, or psychoactive substances. They are universal. People across cultures and time periods report seeing these patterns when in trance. Finding them in rock art suggests that the artists may have been recording visionary experiences, that the images were not just observations of the external world, but maps of inner journeys. Other images show beings that do not exist in nature, creatures with the body of a deer but the wings of a bird, or multiple heads, or impossible proportions. These fantastic beings appear in shamanic traditions worldwide as spirits, ancestors, or gods. Their presence in the rock art of the Altai suggests a cosmology in which the world is populated not just by physical animals and humans, but by a vast array of other entities, some helpful, some dangerous, all requiring respect and proper relations. The later images from the Turkic period include what appear to be tamgus, clan symbols or ownership marks that represented family lineages. These geometric signs are simpler than the earlier animal images, but equally important. They marked identity, belonging, connection to ancestors and land. To carve your tamga into the rock was to claim a relationship with this place, to say we have been here, we belong here, we remember. And throughout the millennia of rock art at Kalbak Tash, there is a recurring theme: humans in relationship with animals. Hunting scenes, yes, but also scenes of herding, of riding, of what appears to be ritual or ceremony involving animals. The art does not show humans as separate from or dominant over nature, but as embedded within it, dependent on it, in constant negotiation with it. The relationship is reciprocal. The animals give their lives so humans can eat, but humans give back. Through ritual, through respect, through the acknowledgement that life depends on death and death feeds life. This worldview is still present in many indigenous Altai traditions today. Animals are not just resources. They are relatives, persons in their own right, beings with whom relationships must be maintained. To hunt is to engage in a sacred transaction. The hunter asks permission. The animal, if willing, gives itself. The hunter must use all parts of the animal, waste nothing, and offer thanks. To fail in these obligations is to break the relationship, and broken relationships have consequences. Modern Altai people still visit Kalbak Tash. They bring offerings, strips of cloth tied to branches, small gifts left at the base of the rocks. They come to connect with their ancestors, to honor the spirits of the place, to maintain the relationships that have sustained them for millennia. For them, the petroglyphs are not artifacts. They are active participants in the ongoing life of the community. The images still speak, the animals still teach, the ancestors still watch. These traditions survived despite centuries of pressure, first from Buddhist and Islamic missionaries, later from Russian Orthodox Christianity, and finally from Soviet atheism, which actively suppressed shamanic practices as primitive superstition. Yet in the remote valleys and high plateaus of the Altai, shamanism never fully died. It went underground, it was practiced in secret, and after the fall of the Soviet Union it re-emerged, not just as a revival, but as a continuity that had never truly been broken. Today there are Altai shamans who still practice the old ways. They climb to sacred mountains like Beluka, like the peaks of the Yukok, to perform rituals. They use drums and throat singing to enter trance states. They speak with the spirits of the land and the ancestors, and they view the landscape itself as alive. But the Altai has drawn seekers of another kind as well. Not indigenous shamans born to the tradition, but outsiders drawn by something they sensed in these mountains, something that called to them across vast distances. In the 1920s and 1930s, a Russian painter named Nicholas Roerich travelled extensively through the Altai. Roerich was not just an artist, he was a mystic, a student of theosophy and Eastern philosophy, and a believer in the existence of hidden spiritual masters who guided humanity from secret enclaves in remote mountain regions. He was searching for Shambhala, the mythical Buddhist kingdom said to be hidden somewhere in the mountains of Central Asia, a place of enlightenment and perfect wisdom, where the initiated could access higher knowledge. Roerich believed the Altai was either the location of Shambhala or a gateway to it. He led expeditions through Siberia, Mongolia, Tibet, and the Himalayas, traveling routes that had been closed to outsiders for centuries. His journals describe meetings with lamas and shamans, sightings of unusual atmospheric phenomena which he interpreted as spiritual signs, and discoveries of ancient ruins and sacred sites. He was convinced that the high mountains of Central Asia held secrets that Western civilization had forgotten. Knowledge of advanced spiritual technologies, of the unity of all religions, of the hidden history of humanity. He painted the mountains obsessively, dramatic, stylized landscapes in vivid blues and purples and golds, showing peaks that seem to glow with inner light. His paintings are not realistic, they are visionary, translating the physical landscape into something symbolic and transcendent. Mountain peaks become cosmic pyramids, clouds become celestial cities, the play of light on snow becomes the radiance of enlightenment itself. To look at a Roerich painting is to see the Altai not as geography, but as metaphysics, mountains as states of consciousness, peaks as aspirations toward the divine. His most famous painting, The Burning of Darkness, shows a mountain glowing with intense golden light while darkness retreats. The symbolism is clear. The mountains are bearers of illumination, destroyers of ignorance, sources of transformation. Roerich's wife Helena was even more deeply immersed in esoteric philosophy. She claimed to channel teachings from one of the hidden masters she called Moria, who she said resided somewhere in the Altai Himalayan region. These teachings became a series of books called the Agni Yoga series, which presented a synthesis of Eastern and Western spiritual traditions, emphasizing the development of spiritual fire or will as the path to evolution. The Roerichs saw their expeditions not as mere exploration but as missions. They were preparing humanity for a new age, rediscovering ancient wisdom that would help civilization transition to a higher state of consciousness. Roerich also made significant contributions to cultural preservation. He proposed the Roerich Pact, an international treaty for the protection of cultural heritage during times of war, a recognition that art and culture belong to all humanity and must be safeguarded. The pact was signed by numerous countries in 1935 and became a precursor to later conventions on cultural protection, including UNESCO's Conventions on World Heritage. But for all his contributions, Roerich's vision of the Altai was a projection. He saw what he wanted to see, a mystical realm, a doorway to enlightenment, a repository of ancient wisdom. He interpreted natural phenomena through an esoteric lens. He saw signs and symbols everywhere. Whether Shambhala is real or a metaphor, whether the Altai holds spiritual secrets or simply the secrets of geology and archaeology, is a question that remains open. What is certain is that people like Roerich have been drawn here for centuries, seeking something beyond the material, something that the mountains seem to promise but never quite deliver. And yet, perhaps that is the point. Perhaps the mountains are not supposed to deliver enlightenment or reveal Shambhala. Perhaps the journey itself is what matters, the willingness to climb, to seek, to believe that there is more to the world than what we can measure and explain. Perhaps the mountains serve their purpose simply by being themselves, remote, beautiful, indifferent, eternal, inviting us to project our deepest longings onto them, to seek meaning in their heights, to find in their silence a space for our own inner questioning. Roerich died in 1947, never having definitively found Shambhala, but his paintings remain vibrant, mystical, strange. They hang in museums and private collections worldwide, continuing to inspire seekers and mystics. And the mountains he painted are still there, still glowing at sunrise, still holding whatever secrets they hold, still calling to those who believe that there are mysteries beyond the reach of science, truths beyond the limits of rational inquiry. And Roerich was not the last. Even today, spiritual seekers come to the Altai. They climb Belukha hoping for visions or enlightenment. They meditate on the Yukok Plateau. They seek out shamans and ask for guidance. New Age groups organize tours to sacred sites. People bring offerings to rock art panels and ancient stone formations. The mountains, with their remoteness and their beauty and their silence, seem to invite such seeking, as if the landscape itself is a kind of temple, a natural cathedral that speaks to something deep within the human psyche, not merely a collection of resources, but a web of relationships, a community of beings both human and other than human, all interconnected. This worldview, often called animism by anthropologists, though the Altai peoples might simply call it reality, sees the mountains as sacred entities, the rivers as beings with their own agency, the animals as kin rather than mere resources. To disturb the land, to remove sacred objects or ancestors from their resting places, is to break relationships and invite imbalance. It is not superstition in this view. It is ecology. It is the recognition that actions have consequences, that the world is responsive, that respect must be given if harmony is to be maintained. The Altai people's resistance to the removal of the Ice Maiden, then, is not merely a cultural preference. It is rooted in a fundamentally different understanding of what the world is and how humans should move through it. The mountains, in this view, are not passive scenery but active participants in the life of the region, and the ancestors buried in them are not mere historical data points. They are still present, still protecting, still part of the community. Consider subscribing to Simply About Earth, where curiosity finds its quiet corner and wonder takes its time. But the Altai has also been a refuge of a different kind, not for mystics seeking enlightenment, but for people fleeing persecution, seeking not transcendence but simple survival. In the 17th century, the Russian Orthodox Church underwent a schism. Reformers sought to standardize liturgy and practices, bringing them closer to Greek Orthodox traditions. But many believers resisted these changes, viewing them as heresy. They became known as the Old Believers, fundamentalists who clung to the old ways of worship, the old texts, the old rituals. They were persecuted, burned at the stake, exiled, and many fled to the most remote corners of the Russian Empire, places where the authorities could not or would not follow. The Altai was one of those places. In the deep valleys and high plateaus, small communities of old believers established themselves, living in isolation, maintaining their traditions, avoiding contact with the outside world. Some of these communities survived for generations, and in 1978, Soviet geologists conducting surveys in a remote valley stumbled upon a family that had been living in complete isolation since the 1930s. The Lykov family. Karp Lykov, his wife and their 4 children had fled into the Altai to escape the Soviet persecution of religion. They built a cabin in a valley so remote that it could only be seen from the air. They had no contact with the outside world. They hunted, foraged, and grew small plots of potatoes and rye. They wore clothes made from hemp they grew themselves. When the geologists found them, the children had never seen another human being outside their family. They spoke an archaic form of Russian. They had no idea that World War II had happened, that Stalin had died, that the world had changed beyond recognition. They lived in a kind of temporal bubble, frozen not in ice, but in time. The outside world was fascinated. Journalists visited. The family was offered help, food, medicine, tools. But the Lykovs were wary. Karp and one daughter, Agafia, refused to leave. The valley was their home. The world beyond was dangerous, corrupt, spiritually compromised. They preferred their isolation. Agafia Lykova still lives in that valley today. She is now in her 70s, one of the last old believers living in complete isolation. Occasionally supplies are brought to her by helicopter. Occasionally journalists visit. But she remains, living as her family did for nearly a century. A living relic of a world that should not still exist but does. A person out of time. The story of the Lykovs is both inspiring and tragic. It speaks to human resilience, the ability to survive in conditions that would kill most people, to maintain faith and identity in the face of overwhelming pressure. But it also speaks to the cost of that survival. The isolation, the poverty, the loss of connection to the larger human community. The Lykovs were free in their valley, but they were also imprisoned by it. The mountains that protected them also cut them off. And this duality, sanctuary and prison, protection and isolation, is perhaps the defining characteristic of the Altai itself. It is a place where people and cultures have come to hide, to preserve themselves, to escape the pressures of the outside world. But it is also a place where they become frozen, unable to change, unable to move forward, held in stasis by the very remoteness that saves them. The Pazyryk in their tombs, the old believers in their valleys, the Denisovans in their cave, all of them preserved by the Altai, but all of them also in a sense trapped. The mountains give and the mountains take away. They remember, but they do not release. Today, the Altai is home to several indigenous ethnic groups, each with their own language, traditions, and relationship to the land. The Altai people, Altai Kizi, are the largest group, living primarily in the Altai Republic of Russia. They speak a Turkic language and practice a blend of shamanism and Buddhism known as Burkhan or Arkjang, the White Faith. The Telengit people live in the high plateaus of the southern Altai, including the Yukok region. They are pastoralists, herding yaks, sheep, and horses in the summer pastures and descending to sheltered valleys in winter. The Telengit way of life is precisely adapted to the extreme environment. They know which pastures green up first in spring, which valleys offer shelter from winter winds, where to find water in dry years. This knowledge is not written in books but passed down through generations, embedded in stories and songs, and direct teaching from elder to youth. To the northwest are the Tuvan people, famous for their throat singing, a form of overtone singing called hume, in which a single vocalist produces multiple pitches simultaneously, creating an eerie harmonic drone that sounds like wind or water or some elemental force. The technique involves manipulating the vocal tract to emphasize different overtones of a fundamental pitch. A skilled throat singer can produce a low drone and simultaneously a high whistling melody. Two distinct musical lines from one person. Throat singing is ancient, passed down through generations, and it is intimately connected to the landscape. Different styles mimic different sounds. The flowing of rivers called Sigit, the wind across steppes, the gait of horses. There is a style called Kargira that produces an incredibly deep growling sound, like the rumble of distant thunder or the movement of glaciers. To hear Tuvan throat singing in the Altai is to hear the mountains themselves given voice, to hear music that is not imposed on the landscape but drawn from it. The Kazakhs of the Altai are the eagle hunters, continuing a tradition that dates back at least 4,000 years. A hunter captures a young golden eagle, trains it to hunt foxes and rabbits, and forms a bond with the bird that lasts a lifetime. The training takes months. The eagle must learn to respond to calls, to return after a hunt, to trust the hunter enough to perch on the arm even with prey nearby. The relationship is not one of dominance but partnership. The hunter respects the eagle's power and independence. The eagle learns to cooperate with the hunter's goals. The eagle becomes a partner, a companion, almost a family member. Hunters speak of their eagles with affection and pride. They describe each bird's personality. Some are bold and aggressive, others cautious and calculating. Some are loyal, others independent. When the eagle grows old, typically after 10 to 15 years of hunting together, it is released back into the wild to live out its final years in freedom. The tradition is both practical, providing meat and furs in a harsh environment, and deeply symbolic, representing the human relationship with the natural world at its most intimate and reciprocal. These indigenous communities face pressures from multiple directions. Tourism is increasing, bringing income but also pollution, disruption, and the commodification of sacred sites. Visitors climb Baluka without seeking permission or performing proper rituals. Tour groups visit Pazyryk tombs and rock art sites, sometimes causing damage through sheer numbers. The sacred becomes a backdrop for selfies. The profound becomes a tourist attraction. Mining companies seek access to the Altai's rich deposits of gold, copper, and rare earth minerals. The mountains contain valuable resources, metals for electronics, minerals for batteries and solar panels, materials that the global economy demands. Mining would bring jobs and revenue, but it would also bring open pit mines, tailings ponds, toxic runoff, roads carved through pristine valleys. It would destroy sacred sites, disrupt wildlife, and fundamentally alter landscapes that have remained relatively unchanged for millennia. Climate change is altering the seasonal patterns that traditional pastoralism depends on. Snowfall is less predictable, permafrost is melting, glaciers are retreating. Telling-it herders report that spring comes at different times each year, now making it difficult to know when to move herds to high pastures. Winters are sometimes warmer but also more unpredictable, with sudden cold snaps that can kill livestock. Traditional knowledge accumulated over centuries becomes less reliable when the climate itself is changing. Young people are leaving for cities, seeking education and economic opportunities. The population of remote Altai villages is aging, schools close, traditional languages become endangered. Shamanic knowledge, once passed from mentor to apprentice over years of training, is not being transmitted because there are fewer apprentices. The chain of cultural continuity, maintained for thousands of years, is at risk of breaking. And yet there is resilience. Indigenous organizations are working to preserve languages and traditions. The Altai Republic has established programs to teach Altai language in schools. Cultural centers document traditional practices. Young people are learning throat singing and eagle hunting. Shamans are openly practicing again, no longer forced to hide their rituals as they were during Soviet times. The indigenous view of the mountains as sacred, alive, relational, is also gaining traction in environmental circles. Scientists now recognize that indigenous land management practices often result in better conservation outcomes than top-down government policies. The idea that nature is a web of relationships rather than a collection of resources is converging with ecological science, which tells us that ecosystems are complex, interconnected, and that every action has cascading consequences. Perhaps the Altai peoples have been right all along. Perhaps treating the mountains as sacred is not primitive superstition, but sophisticated ecology. Perhaps respecting the dead, honoring the ancestors, and viewing the land as a living community are not obstacles to progress, but models for it. And perhaps the Altai itself, with its deep history of cultural crossroads and its profound preservation of the past, has something to teach us about how to live in a world where the past and the present, the human and the more than human, the sacred and the material, are not opposites but aspects of the same reality. But there is one more layer to the Altai story, one more mystery that the mountains have held and are now slowly revealing, and it is a mystery that connects the deepest past to the most pressing future. The permafrost that has preserved the Pazyryk tombs, that has held the Denisovan DNA intact for 40,000 years, that has kept the Ice Maiden's tattoos visible and the felt carpets bright, is melting. Global temperatures are rising. Even here, in these remote heights, the effects of climate change are unmistakable. The glaciers on Belukha are retreating. The permafrost is thawing. And as it thaws, it is releasing what it has held. In some places, this means archaeological treasures coming to light. Tombs that have been frozen for millennia are being exposed, giving archaeologists a brief window to excavate before the organic materials decompose. It is a race against time, to save what the ice has saved, to document what is being lost. But in other places, what the permafrost releases is more troubling. Ancient pathogens, frozen for thousands of years, are being released as the ice melts. Anthrax spores from long-dead animals are causing outbreaks in reindeer herds and infecting humans. There are concerns that other diseases, perhaps even ones that modern immune systems have never encountered, could be released as permafrost continues to thaw. And there is carbon. Vast amounts of organic matter, dead plants and animals, accumulated over millennia, are locked in the permafrost. As it melts, bacteria decompose this material, releasing carbon dioxide and methane into the atmosphere. Methane is a particularly potent greenhouse gas. The thawing of permafrost creates a feedback loop. Warming causes thawing, which releases methane, which causes more warming, which causes more thawing. The permafrost regions of the world, including the Altai, are becoming not carbon sinks but carbon sources, contributing to the very warming that is destroying them. The ice that has been the Altai's memory, its preservation mechanism, its defining characteristic for millennia, is disappearing, And with it will go the tombs that have not yet been found, the DNA that has not yet been sequenced, the organic materials that have survived nowhere else on Earth. The Ice Maiden may be one of the last such perfectly preserved burials we will ever find. Future generations may look back and envy us this window into the past, a window that is closing even now. But the loss is not just archaeological. The indigenous peoples of the Altai are also facing the consequences of a warming climate. Permafrost degradation destabilizes the ground, making it difficult to build or maintain infrastructure. Changes in seasonal patterns disrupt traditional pastoralism. Animals cannot find forage, water sources dry up or flood unpredictably. The ecological balance that indigenous communities have depended on for centuries is shifting, sometimes catastrophically. And perhaps most poignantly, the mountains themselves are changing. The eternal snows are not so eternal anymore. The glaciers that have crowned Belukha for millions of years are shrinking. The ice that has defined this landscape, that has preserved its secrets, that has made the Altai what it is melting, draining away into rivers that flow to distant seas, taking with it the frozen record of the past. The Altai, then, is not just a record of deep time, it is also a harbinger of the future. It shows us what we stand to lose, not just artifacts and scientific data, but entire ways of life, ecological systems, and the very stability of landscapes that have seemed permanent. It shows us that even the most remote and rugged places on Earth are not immune to the changes we are causing. The ice that has kept the Altai's secrets for millennia is melting, and the secrets are disappearing. And so we climb, in our imaginations, higher into these eternal peaks. The air grows thin, the stars grow bright, the silence deepens. We stand on a ridge and look out over valleys that the Denisovans walked, that the Pazyryk rode through, that the old believers hid in. We stand where shamans have stood for 10,000 years, seeking visions and communing with spirits. We stand in a landscape that is both deeply ancient and acutely present. A place where time is not a straight line but a spiral, where past and present and future are all visible at once, all layered like ice and sediment and stone. And perhaps here, in this thin, cold air, we understand something that is hard to grasp at lower altitudes. We understand that we are not separate from the past. We carry it in our genes, in our cultures, in our bodies. The Denisovans are not extinct. They live in us, in the genes that help Tibetans breathe at high altitude. The Pazyryk are not gone. Their art style, their horse culture, their shamanic traditions have echoed through Central Asian peoples for 25 centuries. The mountains that the Altai people call sacred are sacred, not because of supernatural forces, but because they are the keepers of memory, the holders of context, the physical anchor of continuity in a world that is always changing. We understand that preservation is not just about keeping objects intact. It is about maintaining relationships, honoring connections, respecting that which has come before. The Ice Maiden's tattoos are beautiful, but they are also painful to look at, because we know that her people did not want her disturbed, that her removal has caused grief and anger, and a sense of violation that no amount of scientific knowledge can fully compensate for. There is a cost to our curiosity. There is a responsibility that comes with knowledge, and we understand, finally, that the mountains are not just scenery. They are not resources to be extracted or obstacles to be overcome. They are themselves. They are beings in their own right, ancient, powerful, indifferent to our concerns but not separate from them. The mountains shape the people who live among them. They create cultures and preserve them. They isolate and they connect. They kill and they protect. They remember. The Altai is not just a place where interesting things happened in the past. It is a place where past and present are still woven together, where the frozen dead still speak, where ancient traditions still persist, where the landscape itself is a living archive. It is a place that asks us to see time differently, not as a river flowing in one direction, but as ice, layered and compressed, holding everything at once. And as the ice melts, as the permafrost thaws and the glaciers retreat, and the climate warms, the Altai is teaching us one more lesson. It is teaching us that nothing is permanent, that even mountains change, that preservation is always temporary, that every moment of stability is a gift, not a guarantee, that the past is always vanishing, and that makes it precious. The Denisovans left us only fragments. The Pazyryk left us frozen tombs. The Old Believers left us a single family in a remote valley. The shamans leave us songs and visions that cannot be translated. And the mountains leave us this: a place where the weight of time is tangible, where the depth of history is felt in the thin cold air, where the presence of the past is not a metaphor but a physical reality. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep, let yourself climb in imagination to those high peaks. Let the air grow thin and the stars grow bright. Let the silence settle. You stand on the Yukok Plateau where the Ice Maiden rested for 25 centuries. You stand at the mouth of Denisova Cave where 3 human species once lived. You stand where petroglyphs show mammoths and shamans, where felt carpets were woven, where eagles hunt and horses run free. You stand in a place where time is layered like sediment, where 40,000 years of human story are compressed into stone and ice and gene and memory, and you realize that you are part of that story, that the Denisovan DNA in Tibetan bodies, the Scythian animal style in modern art, the shamanic traditions still practiced in remote valleys, all of it connects us to this place, to this deep history, to these eternal mountains. The ice will melt, the permafrost will thaw, the glaciers will retreat, but the mountains will remain. Changed, yes, diminished, perhaps, but still here, still keeping their secrets, still holding what they can hold, still teaching those who have the patience to listen. The Altai asks nothing of us. It does not need our understanding or our reverence. It simply is, and has been, and will be, long after we are gone. But we need it. We need places that are older than our civilizations, that remember what we have forgotten, that hold in their ice and stone the proof that we are not the first or the only or the final chapter in the human story. We need the humility that comes from standing in places where our ancestors stood, where other human species stood, where the weight of deep time presses down and makes our own moment feel both precious and small. And so tonight, let the Altai be your companion in sleep. Let its peaks be the last thing you see before your eyes close. Let its silence be the sound that carries you into dreams. Let its ice hold you, as it has held so many others, in its perfect temporary embrace. You have climbed to the heights where the air is thin and cold and clean, where the stars are close enough to touch, where the wind carries the sound of throats singing across valleys that have heard that sound for 4,000 years, where eagles circle and horses run and the dead rest beneath stone and ice, their tattoos still visible, their stories still told. This is the Altai, the Golden Mountains, the meeting place of nations and species and times, the keeper of secrets, the holder of memory, the place where the past is not past but present, frozen, preserved, waiting. Rest now, the mountains will keep watch, the ice will hold, the stars will turn, and when you wake the Altai will still be there, remote and beautiful and eternal, a place where curiosity finds its quiet corner and wonder takes its time. Good night from Simply About Earth. Sleep well.